indicate Senator Shaheen and Senator Blumenthal have both spoken to me repeatedly about the importance of this hearing, and they're much of the impetus for us having this hearing, and I thank them for that. In late October of 2011, an early snowstorm dropped as much as 3 feet of snow on East Coast states, resulting in widespread power outages. Only a month before that, Hurricane Irene had done extensive damage to electricity systems in the same region. Today's hearing is going to look at these and other weather-related events in order to inform the committee as to whether actions are necessary to improve preparation for and response to such events. We'll hear from the Department of Energy, which has a significant role in gathering and communicating data during and after electrical emergencies. We will hear from FERC, who is conducting an investigation, along with NERC, on the outages that resulted from the October snowstorm in New England. We'll also hear from those who were on the ground in New Hampshire and Connecticut during the event and the ones that preceded it. Weather-related outages are often almost entirely distribution-level events. That does not mean, however, that we at the federal level have no concern over these kinds of events or no role in helping to prepare for them or respond to them. We know that there have been many other weather-related electricity system emergencies over the last few years. Tornadoes caused damage in Texas, Alabama, and the Midwest. Hurricanes along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, storm-related damage in Washington State and the Northwest. All of these have cost lives and property and economic loss. Seems to me these kinds of events happen more frequently than they did in years past, but it is difficult to be sure of that since increases in reported outages resulting from improved reporting may be caused by actual outages, may be caused by increased reporting. I'll be interested to hear how the reporting systems for these events work, whether or not they can be improved. I also look forward to the recommendations of the witnesses for ways to improve our communication and response systems to these emergencies. Let me call on Senator Murkowski for any comments she has before we hear from our witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you mentioned, we're scheduled to hear testimony on grid reliability in light of the power outages that we saw in New England last October after a historic event there. Alaska's had its kind of share of historic weather. We beat all of our snow records certainly in Anchorage, in many communities in South Central. The National Guard was called out to help uncover or dig out the community of Cordova. They got 18 feet in the course of a couple weeks there. I think they ended out the winter at 25 feet of snow. So it's been a long, tough winter. The good news for us is that it's melting. But we're here to talk about what role we may have in dealing with power outages when we have these weather events. It does appear that many of New England's weather-related problems last fall were at the local level. I am perhaps a little concerned that we may be blurring the lines between our proper federal role in overseeing the bulk power system and the historic state role in maintaining the distribution system. I do understand that FERC, working with NERC, has an ongoing inquiry into the New England situation. There's a final report that's expected just about 4 weeks from now. Possibly we would have been better served with this hearing had we waited until that report was finalized, because we could have seen what that federal nexus is for a full committee hearing, but we would also have had the benefit of our grid regulators' findings and recommendations. But we're here this morning. We must thoroughly examine our response to storm-caused outages so that we can plan better and prepare for the next emergency, because we know that there's going to be another storm that comes our way that will drag down the power lines. New England got hit with a record storm only 2 months after Hurricane Irene. The Northeast got knocked again this week with late spring snow. And the problem that we face is whether whether we're talking hurricane, blizzard, tornado, whatever the act of God may be, we can't know for sure the extent and the challenges until it actually hits us. But in working to ensure the reliability of our nation's grid, there are some challenges that we can foresee and for which we can take preventative action. I've spent some considerable time this Congress asking both FERC and EPA to balance electric reliability needs with the suite of new federal rules regulating power plant emissions. I'm now working on safety valve legislation so that the cumulative effect of these federal regs does not threaten electric reliability. Today, I'm hopeful, Mr. Chairman, we will have enough members before the committee to consider the two FERC nominees, Commissioner Norris and Mr. Clark. If they are approved by the full Senate, I expect both commissioners to uphold FERC's electricity reliability mandate, especially if another agency's regulations could adversely impact our nation's grid. Commissioner Norris has told us that he has, quote, encouraged EPA to consider the cumulative impact of their regulations. But unfortunately, I don't think that that's good enough. Only 2 weeks ago, the President established a national interagency task force on shale gas development to ensure that federal regulations are well coordinated and are not duplicative. I don't think that we need an executive order to get our agencies to work together, but perhaps we need one to maintain electricity reliability. At the very least, I do hope that FERC will immediately convene another technical conference to gather evidence regarding the cumulative impact of EPA's new power plant regs. So I look forward to the testimony that we will receive today and hope that we can learn from those who gathered. Thank you.
Thank you. As I indicated, both Senator Shaheen and Senator Blumenthal urged that we have this hearing, and I know Senator Blumenthal would like to introduce one of our witnesses from Connecticut, and Senator Shaheen introduce one of our witnesses from New Hampshire. Why don't you go right ahead, Senator Blumenthal, and make any statements you'd like to make.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you personally for having this hearing. I know that your leadership was instrumental, and thank Senator Murkowski as well, but particularly Senator Shaheen, who has been a partner in this effort and who has been extraordinarily attuned to the challenges that her state of New Hampshire faced in the wake of these very unusual storms. I want to say at the very beginning that there are lessons here that can be learned by states across the country, and I believe strongly by the federal government. And I have two recommendations in particular that come from the experience of the Connecticut Norwich Public Utilities, which is represented here today by John Bilda and will be a witness before you. And he will tell you about the Norwich Utility story, which is a success story. And that's why there are lessons to be learned from it. While more than 800,000 consumers around the state of Connecticut, after each of these two storms, Irene and then the October snowstorm, suffered without power for days on end, Norwich restored power to 98% of their customers within 48 hours of Hurricane Irene. And so I'm really delighted that Mr. Bilda, who has a strong background in public utilities, will be here today to talk a little bit about his firsthand experience with restoring power in the wake of these catastrophic storms. I have two recommendations. I'm urging the committee to review the mutual assistance group process for shareholder-owned utilities and enact measures ensuring that every state has ready access to an adequate number of line crews following a disaster. Part of this process is to prepare for the unexpected and the catastrophic eventualities that follow a hurricane or other natural disaster in terms of outages, and a proper mutual assistance group procedure where line crews come from other states and are available in states that need them, I think is absolutely essential. And then second, I'm urging that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission provide clear direction and incentives for utilities to establish microgrids, which is really part of a smart grid strategy. Microgrids that will help ensure that at least a portion of the town or city has some electricity during the next big storm. After each of these storms, Mr. Chairman, I toured the state day after day, and what I found was senior citizens and families in shelters. There were more than 50 shelters in the small state of Connecticut. There were people who went to hospitals in the wake of these storms because they had no power at home, and they needed the power in hospitals simply to run their oxygen supplying equipment if they needed it, or other essential medical equipment. And in the wake of each of these storms, there were real-life threatening emergencies that existed because power was out in whole cities across swaths of regions. And microgrids are really a very, very important step toward ensuring that there is power in at least part of towns to provide essential services. I want to be very blunt. We received strong aid eventually from mutual assistance groups after each of these storms, but it took time. And that's why the process needs to be strengthened, so that there are some guarantees and some specific arrangements, as the Norwich Public Utilities was able to do through its reaching out and establishing those relationships through the organization that actually Mr. Gilda heads, which is a regional group in the New England area. And that kind of mutual aid was very important to the work that he did. On the issue of microgrids, there is a real need for FERC to clarify and affirm that these microgrids are consistent with tariffs. I know this statement sounds highly bureaucratized, and perhaps it is, but the fact of the matter is that our regional operating system has been as much an impediment to these microgrids by failing to clarify that they are consistent with the tariffs. It needs strong direction from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I think that smart grids, microgrids that operate within a confined and discrete area are really part of our energy future. I would close simply by saying that we need policies that encourage self-managed, vertically integrated designs that realize the investments that are being made right now. Northeast Public Utilities, or I should say more correctly, the CMAC, which is the organization that it is a part of, has invested $40 million in the microgrid in its area. The benefits can be realized only if ISO New England cooperates and clarifies and affirms that it is consistent with tariffs, and FERC's direction is absolutely necessary to pursue that end. And these issues have much broader ramifications. We will be considering cybersecurity measures in the United States Senate, hopefully at some point this spring. One of the reasons for considering the cyber threats is the threat to our grids, and one of the ways to make sure that we are protected is to make these microgrids serve parts of cities, parts of towns, regions that will offer even greater security if any of our grids, the major grids, are threatened and if outages occur. So I think that there are many broader ramifications to the outages that we suffered during these storms. And again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. Thank Senator Shaheen for her leadership, and thank you very much, Senator Murkowski, for being so receptive. I realize that the storms in Connecticut may seem tame to what you go through in Alaska, and we can learn a lot from you as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Why don't you go right ahead and introduce whoever you'd like at this point, make any statements you'd like.
Thank you very much, Chairman Bingaman, and I would like to echo Senator Blumenthal in thanking both you and Ranking Member Murkowski for convening the hearing today. As Senator Blumenthal said, we started talking about our concern with what's happening with the reliability of our country's electricity grid after several weather-related events last year, Hurricane Irene, and then, of course, the October snowstorm that left about 2 million customers throughout New England without power, 315,000 of those in New Hampshire. And looking at the news on a regular basis, it doesn't take too long to figure out that it's, at least in my recollection, it seems like we're experiencing more frequent catastrophic weather-related events. And I think, Mr. Chairman, I understood that you were going to be showing this chart from the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability from the Department of Energy that really charts the increased weather disturbances since 2000, and they're significant, with a significant impact on customers. So given what appears to be happening, my concern, and I know it's shared by Senator Blumenthal and by everybody on this committee, is that we look at ways in which we can encourage, whether it's through better standards or through incentivizing innovation for new developments in protecting our electricity grid, that we really need to look at how we can address these outages, because it's no longer a situation where we think, well, once in every 5 or 10 years we're going to get a significant weather event that's going to require being without power for a while. This has become a much more frequent occurrence, and one in which I think we really need to look at how we can better prepare to respond to this. Now, I'm really pleased that on our second panel this morning, we have someone from New Hampshire who has spent most of the last 10 years chairing the Public Utilities Commission in New Hampshire. Tom Getz was chairman of the PUC in New Hampshire from 2001 until 2011. He recently stepped down. I'm pleased to say that I appointed him to that position as governor, and he was reappointed again in 2007 by another governor. So clearly it shows the excellent job that he did in that capacity. Before that, he served as the executive director of our state's Public Utilities Commission. And I think he has a number of accomplishments, but one of them that I really wanted to point out this morning is that during his time as chair of New Hampshire's Public Utilities Commission, one of the things that he did was manage an effort to create the New England States Committee on Electricity, which is a regional committee approved by FERC to focus on resource adequacy and transmission planning. And I think based on his experience, he has a lot of expertise to share with us this morning, so I look forward to his testimony and am delighted that he is here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much. We have as our first panel Ms. Patricia Hoffman, who's the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability at the Department of Energy. Please give us your views as to what we need to know on this subject, and then we'll have some questions.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Department of Energy's roles and responsibility during weather-related electrical outages. DOE plays a vital role coordinating with other federal agencies in the energy sector to prepare for and recover from such outages. With the increase of severe weather, including the recent tornadoes in Texas and the Midwest, and the approach of the 2012 hurricane season, this discussion is especially timely and important. At the Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability, our mission is to lead national efforts to modernize the electric grid, enhance the security and reliability of our nation's energy infrastructure, and facilitate recovery from disruptions to the energy supply. As a sector-specific agency for energy under the Department of Homeland Security National Infrastructure Protection Plan, our office works closely with federal, state, and local governments and industry to protect against and mitigate threats to the energy infrastructure, whether they're caused by natural disasters, deliberate attack, or human error. DOE is also the lead agency for Emergency Support Function 12, also known as ESF 12, for energy, when activated by the Federal Energy Management Agency, FEMA, under the Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act. In the event of an emergency, we provide situational awareness, we coordinate response among federal, state, and local agencies, and help facilitate restoration of energy systems. When we are activated, we have a team of responders who specialize in energy infrastructure and can be quickly activated and deployed to the event's location. These responders provide situational awareness, facilitate clear and consistent communication with other deployed responders, and provide subject matter expertise to help with restoration and identify where the federal government can possibly engage in restoration efforts. We maintain constant communication with our federal partners, including FEMA, the Department of Homeland Security, Transportation, Defense, EPA, as well as state agencies and energy companies affected by the event. We provide timely and accurate, providing timely, accurate, and situational assessments play a crucial role in helping other government agencies and industry prepare for and recover from power outages caused by these events. Reporting also allows the public to remain informed of the situation and plan accordingly. During a major energy outage, the situation typically changes very rapidly, and information can often be conflicting and incomplete. As the storm moves through an area, the number of customers without power can jump quickly. Following the storm, as utility crews restore power, outage numbers can change hourly as repairs are made. With Hurricane Irene, for example, customer outages fluctuated dramatically over a 9-day period. 80% of the customers in the Northeast were restored within 3 days. During outage events, energy companies focus on their specific service territories. States and local governments focus on their specific jurisdictions. Our situations reports are a definitive source for obtaining a broad, clear perspective on outage location, scope, potential duration, looking at the entire affected region. These reports provide responders with sound information to determine where federal resources should be applied to facilitate faster recovery and restoration. DOE is keenly aware that the energy sector owns and operates a vast majority of our nation's assets. Communication channels that we maintain with our private partners have been and will continue to be invaluable when major outages occur. OE works closely on an ongoing basis with owners and operators of the energy infrastructure to communicate clearly and frequently about power outages and collaborating with them as they prepare for energy emergencies by conducting workshops, tabletop exercise, and provide resources for energy assurance planning. We also work closely with industry groups such as the Edison Electric Institute on the importance of their members to provide timely, accurate, and consistent data during recovery and restoration periods. I would also like to briefly highlight the findings from our assessment from our recent improvements made by the energy sector. Our 2010 report entitled Hardening and Resiliency, U.S. Energy Industry's Response to the Recent Hurricane Season, notes actions that industry has taken to harden their energy systems, including replacing wooden poles with concrete or steel, strengthening pole with guide wires, elevating substations and control rooms, improving supply logistics. Companies have also deployed sophisticated sensors, such as phasor measurement units, to evaluate the health of their systems, and advanced meters for outage management systems, as well as other advanced technologies. Integration of these smart grid technologies can reduce restoration times by detecting the location and the extent of damage and isolating the problem to keep the grid operating during an emergency. Reporting timely, accurate, and actionable information during emergencies is critical to helping federal, state, and local government agencies, as well as the energy sector and Americans everywhere, be more aware of the rapid evolving impact of severe weather events on the energy infrastructure, and most importantly of all, remain safe. This concludes my statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your time. I look forward to answering any questions you and your colleagues may have.
Okay, let me start by asking a few questions. We've got a chart that I think maybe we were going to distribute around to folks called Major Electric Power Disruptions. Have you looked at that chart?
I need to see
Okay, she's bringing it to you there. And do members of the committee have copies? Why don't you give them to folks here so everyone's got a copy? At any rate, the clear conclusion from this is stated right below the chart itself. It says large-scale electricity disruptions in the United States and southern Canada have increased significantly since the early 1990s, even as changes in electric power generation have been modest. Do you agree with that conclusion? Do you folks keep track of this kind of thing yourself in your office, in the department? Is this something that is valid from your perspective?
We do keep track of the different weather events and the impact of those weather events across the United States. Whether they're increasing significantly, I don't have our data to give you that information today. Looking at this is the NERC information with respect to outages that you've presented here. But there has been stronger storms, there has been stronger tornadoes, there has been more stronger snowstorms. So there is some at least indication that there are some stronger events occurring in the United States.
Well, perhaps you could take this chart and review it after the hearing and see if there's anything in here that is questionable or misleading. And if so, advise us of that, or if you have better information, we'd be anxious to see it.
Okay.
Another issue is on reporting, particularly reporting of distribution level disturbances. The MIT Energy Initiative issued a study last December on the future of the electric grid. And in that study, they recommended the IEEE standard reporting metric for distribution level disturbances. They said that that should be followed uniformly throughout the industry, and it is not today. Do you agree with that recommendation, and do you have authority or the ability to try to see that that's implemented?
So let me start off. The reporting standard is the if I understand the standard, it's the IEEE 1355 standard, which looks at the duration and frequency of outages in the United States. It's an index of system average interruption frequency. And so it takes a look at the frequency, the number of customers interrupted, as well as the duration. And then it makes it an index by dividing by the total customers in a service territory. What the IEEE standard did was it took that and broke it into two categories: major events and day-to-day events. So that is a standard that is looking at trying to really pull together how do we start doing some correlations with outage events and day-to-day events. So the reporting of that should be looked at as a standard across the industry for reporting. It is perceived that there is inconsistent reporting mechanisms at this moment in time. And if we are going to move forward in correlating and looking at the impact as well as future investments that may be needed, we do need a standardized form to collect.
Is there any action you can take in your position to implement this recommendation and see to it that these distribution level disturbances are uniformly reported?
We can use the information that is collected as following the IEEE standard as one mechanism of making use of that information. We do not have enforcement mechanism, nor do we have any requirements of enforcing that.
Okay, all right. Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hoffman, thank you for your comments here this morning. This is an interesting chart that the chairman has shared. I'm a little curious about that, but I think we recognize that while we can have some pretty massive outages that are caused by weather and random weather patterns, we've also got the consequences of policy decisions, those deliberate decisions that are made here in Washington. And I have expressed a great deal of concern about this cumulative impact of on reliability from this slew of EPA regulations that we're seeing that are coming out that impact and affect the energy industry that I don't believe are being adequately examined and considered. Now, last year, DOE did do an analysis of resource adequacy, but it was actually Dr. Majumdar's who had testified, and he said that the report actually came from the Office of Policy and International Affairs in producing the report, not your office, which is the Office of Electric Deliverability and Reliability. It's further my understanding that not only did DOE fail to consider the entire suite of the new pending EPA regs that were forthcoming on the power sector, but they also did not consult with either the FERC or the NERC in that analysis. So a couple questions to you along these lines this morning. First of all, why wouldn't it be the Office of Electricity Deliverability and Reliability that would head up this type of a review?
The report was done from the policy office because the policy office was looking at the impact of any policy recommendations or policy statements on the administration. Our office tends to look at, I'll say, emergency-related events, energy events on the system, and we do the modeling and the analytics with respect to emergency events, and that's been our mission and our focus in looking at what is the technology to improve the energy infrastructure, what is any potential impacts from weather or emergency events, and then how do we facilitate the recovery from those events. And that's been the focus and the mission of our organization.
So you are suggesting that you look at those more intermittent or random impacts to the power generation as opposed to what policy impacts may come from other agencies? I'm just trying to understand the difference here.
We work within our department to look at policy events, but we do not have the lead responsibility from the policy in the Department of Energy.
So do you have any idea why FERC or NERC would not be considered in an analysis of what you're doing with a focus on the impact of regulations coming out of other agencies on the electricity sector and the reliability of that sector?
I don't have the information to answer that.
So let me ask in another way then, would your office, as the one that is tasked to look at the specifics of electricity deliverability and reliability, would you consider conducting an assessment of the cumulative impact of the regulations that are coming primarily out of EPA on the nation's grid? Is that something that you would consider doing?
We would consider doing or participating in any study or event that would be conducted either from the policy office, FERC, NERC, or other agencies to the impact of reliability, yes.
So you're saying you would participate, but you wouldn't take the lead?
If Congress requests us to take the lead and do the action, we will be glad to take that.
Well, the concern that I have and I continue to raise is that this seeming inability to assess the cumulative impact of the regulations on the reliability aspect of the electricity sector is something that I think is extraordinarily important. And whether we're talking weather or whether we're talking policy, we need to know and understand that we've got a system that is in one piece. I want to move very quickly. I mentioned, and it's public knowledge, I've been working on safety valve legislation as it relates to our electricity reliability and the processes that we're dealing with. One of the underlying problems that we have with the reliability is clearly transmission congestion, our inability to build out the transmission in an adequate pace. I believe that you made a statement last week in a briefing to staff that the generation can be built in 3 to 5 years, but if we're lucky, it's about 10 years for the transmission lines. Under the Utility MAC rule, which requires compliance by 2015, it does allow for an additional year or perhaps 2, depending on some circumstances. I don't view that as an adequate safety valve. So the question that I have for you this morning is, given this 10-year time frame that you have indicated is what we're facing as we try to build out transmission lines, doesn't a 3-year or even 4-year or 5-year window for compliance seem problematic, given what we're dealing with the time frames that are involved here?
Thank you for your question. I think what's going to end up having to be looked at is the case-by-case examples. There is flexibility in the system for extensions, for a 4th-year extension, and I believe a 5th-year extension. But the timelines are going to have to, and any concern that a customer may or a owner-operator may have with respect to meeting those timelines, I think should be brought to EPA immediately, be very transparent in the type of solutions that are being looked at and their timelines requested. So that is probably going to be dealt with on a state-by-state basis, specifically with EPA.
So if you had to identify what you would consider to be a reasonable amount of time, you're saying that it's more on a case-by-case basis as opposed to 3 years is reasonable, 4 years is reasonable?
I think it depends on the detail of the project and how far the project is along, what requirements are still necessary of the project. So I'm not going to do an average statement. I think that it's best to look at the project specifically and address that project's need with the proper agencies involved.
Mr. Chairman, I am well over my time. I apologize for that. I also apologize. I have an appropriations markup that began at 10:30, so I'm going to have to excuse myself. And I do wish that I was here for the other witnesses, because I know that they have some interesting things to bring up as well. So thank you, Ms. Hoffman.
Thank you. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hoffman, I was a little confused by your response on the charts that Chairman Bingaman passed around, because he quoted the commentary based on at the bottom of the chart that says major electric power disruptions that's attributed to the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, and to EIA. But the chart on the other side, which I referenced earlier, I have sourced as being your Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability. Is that your understanding?
Yes, I just had not seen these charts before right now, so I apologize. I'm looking at this for the first time.
Okay. And certainly I understand that these are only a period of about 10 years, but just looking at the data reflected in these charts, it certainly looks like the number of weather-related disturbances has increased pretty dramatically, as have the number of households affected by those. Would you agree?
It does look like that, but I would also say that prior to recently, we did not have the outage management systems, the systems in place that can more accurately record some of the impacts to consumers. So it may be in the earlier years, there may be some variances because of reporting that they didn't have the systems in place. So I can only look at
sure,
what the data is.
Sure, that's only a snapshot, I
yes.
understand. Well, talking about the concern for data collection and the need for standardized data collection, are you comfortable that standardized system of data collection is currently in place now?
I think we're heading in the right direction. Where we ultimately need to go is several layered type concept where utilities are first and foremost providing data to their consumers via the website and any text messaging and communications that are available, because consumers need that actionable information for safety of their customers. So some of that entails the number of customers that are out. I think it is very important for customers to understand the extent of damage to the system. So whether you're talking damage to the transmission system versus damage to the distribution system, because that will give a better appreciation of the time for restoration. So that is at the utility level that must occur first and foremost. Then from a state, regional, and national perspective, we need to be able to roll those numbers up to make sure that we get a regional perspective. Once again, I would go with the same philosophy, the number of customers that are out, the extent of damage to the transmission, distribution to substation, the extent of flooding, and then the estimated timelines if available for restoration. So everybody has a situational awareness, especially customers that may need additional support or may need to go to a different facility if the timeline is going to be longer than expected.
And is there a way to have the information reflect other potential issues with, if it's transmission? I assume, at least my experience in New Hampshire has been that most of our outages have not been the result of generation being down, but the result of transmission or distribution issues. Is there a way to reflect whether those lines are aging lines and that that's the cause of the outage in addition to the weather emergency, so that they don't have the same kind of, you talked about the report on the industry response to hurricane season and some of the updated technology that is now being used. Is there a way to reflect that kind of information also in that data, and does it do that now?
It's a fantastic question, and I think we're heading in that direction, and that's what we need to continue to work towards, is have a better understanding of assets and asset management, health and age, so that we actually can see if there's a correlation to, say, a feeder system, a part of the country where there may be more emphasis, the risk may be more, there may be more of a risk to a future hurricane or event of that part of the system going down, so that we actually can look at predictive measures or measures that we can take in advance of a system, knowing that maybe there's been a lot of stress in this region of the country, especially when you've had back-to-back storms. When you've had back-to-back storms, you've put an added stress on whether it's poles, trees, and then having another storm follow so closely after that can make certain elements weaker. And so I think what it will allow us to do is to actually start saying, okay, how do we really want to take a harder look at investments and risk for different parts of the system, whether it's putting guide wires, looking at reinforcing the poles, looking at strategies, and then be able to evaluate the cost impact and the impact to consumers.
I'm out of time, but Mr. Chairman, if I could follow up just on the question that you raised, and that is, who should be the entity that actually describes and prescribes those kinds of standards and data collection? Should it be FERC? Should it be NERC? For us in the Northeast, should it be the Department of Energy?
The standards process, I mean, it's an IEEE standard. I think the standards, there's various standard setting organizations that are very well placed and structured to developing the standards in the United States.
Maybe I wasn't clear. What I should have said is, who should enforce those standards?
I think the enforcement of the standards is going to depend on who has jurisdiction. So from a state regulatory point of view, it's going to be the state utility commissioners and the state regulatory bodies. From the federal perspective, it will be FERC and NERC.
Thank you.
Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. And certainly, while you're talking about a lot of Northeast outages, the Northwest has quite a few outages, and over the past few years, they seem to have multiplied. We had nearly 300,000 customers across the region that were impacted, and we're talking about many days. In fact, I had one constituent who wrote me and said, quote, "As we stretch into the 5th day of power outages with the temperatures dropping into the 20s in the evenings, I know this is the first major outage that most of the rest of the people have experienced so far this year, but it's the worst. And so my power has gone out over 5 times in the last 30 days, usually out for 24 hours. So, these are people who have been impacted many times, and I'm certainly a big fan. We've instituted a new Doppler radar system there that's state-of-the-art technology now that the rest of the nation is implementing. and it's giving us more predictability, and we need to do a lot, as we were talking about with last week's hearing on just rise at sea level. We need to have a more weather-ready nation. There's lots of things we can do to make sure that we have the information from a scientific perspective about what the impacts are going to be, and then actually plan for them. And but you got to have the information first, then local governments, law enforcement, responders, everybody can develop the plan. But in this case, you know, over the last decade, we have seen, you know, a huge increase in these outages due to extreme weather events. And some estimates are, so a strong investment in grid, obviously in smart grid and distributed generation, in backup generation, and things that would help us basically diversify and build redundancy. Some people think that building that future system would be somewhere between $17 and $24 billion a year over the next 20 years. Well, if you look at what that might actually reduce in estimates, you know, something outages are costing us somewhere around $40 billion per year. So how do you look at this issue from an investment perspective? I look at some of those numbers and say, geez, a 10-year investment in modernizing the grid and getting distributed generation and getting, you know, some of these other investments in place would pay back over a short time period the cost that it is taking us to deal with all these outages, to say nothing of the impacts that we're having on consumers.
It's a very good point. With respect to the economic impact, there is significant economic impact to the country during these events. I know that NOAA estimated that Hurricane Katrina was 105, make sure I got my units right, $105 billion in economic damage. And so it is, how do we look at financing investments in the infrastructure over time to minimize the impact to the economy and also minimize any sort of impact from these events. So what I would look at is a continued steady improvement in our infrastructure, acknowledging if we could have better data and information, then we actually can fine-tune where the technology improvement can get the biggest benefit or the biggest impact, the biggest bang for the buck. So what we really need to do is actually continue to collect the data and build the analytical capabilities so we can start developing those correlations and prioritize the investment in our infrastructure so we can look at where do we get the most value from composite poles, from guide wires, from distributed generation, and looking at microgrids. Where has the intensity of storms been increasing, and look at should we be building the same and using the same technologies after our hurricane, or should we be looking to place improved technologies on the system? Right now, when we rebuild, it is the same technologies that's being put back on the system to the extent that the costs are equal. So it is an investment strategy that has to go hand in hand with the developing of rate structures and rates at the distribution level.
But do you think that that number analysis, like a 10-year, you know, time period for payback, do you think that's realistic, doable? You think it can be done sooner? You think, I hear what you're saying. You want to do it smartly. You want to invest in the right technology. You want to see what matters. But I feel like because of that, the reason why you're here today and we're having this hearing is because a lot of people are frustrated that not enough is happening at the state and local levels. So we want to see more action. We'd love, you know, your agency to play a more leadership role, but you're talking about doing this incremental analysis. And I think what we have to get down to is some analogy, at least maybe to like weatherization and the investment we make in weatherization and the time period for payback. We have to start basically putting out there what we think, how quickly the investment will pay dividends to us. And I think if we do, then I think we'll get much more aggressive results at the local level in pushing people to make these investments for us.
I agree with your point, and the discussion is how fast should we invest and at what level can the consumer, the economy tolerate with respect to that investment. The money that's required is significant, so how should we plan for the investments that are required and manage those difficult funding situations?
Well, I think from our state's perspective, we've had two of these, what someone would call 100-year events back to back, doing devastating economic damage, to the state. And now you start talking about, all sorts of businesses and industries that are impacted. You look at, the tornado that may have hit the Boeing facility in the Midwest. And, these are all issues of, if we are seeing more severe weather, how are we going to best prepare for it? And I think a grid that's much more reliable and resilient is going to be a key part of that. So I thank the chairman for this hearing.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Unless there's additional questions, why don't we go ahead to panel 2, and we'll dismiss you, and thank you very much. If you do have any reaction to this chart that we gave to you, we'd be anxious to hear that in the coming days.
We would be glad to be able to provide you a response.
All right, thank you very much. Let me call forward the second panel. It's made up of Mr. Norman Bay, who is the Director of the Office of Enforcement of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And let me just say, since we've had very effusive introductions of the other two members of the panel, I want to say some effusive things about Mr. Bay. He is a distinguished former U.S. attorney in the state of New Mexico and a former professor at the University of New Mexico Law School, and does a tremendous job at every position he fills, and we're glad to have him here. So Mr. Bay is our first witness on this panel. Mr. Thomas Getz, who is previously introduced as the former chair of the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission in Concord. And Mr. John Bilda is the general manager with Norwich Public Utilities in Norwich, Connecticut. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Bay, go right ahead. Yeah, I think that's probably okay if the light's on. Okay, and why don't each of you take about 5 minutes, make the main points you think we need to understand, and we will include your full statement in the record. Go right ahead. Yeah, I think that would be best if you could just summarize it. Let's be sure the recorder's got it the way she wants it there. Go ahead, please.
Okay. So we have engaged in a joint study with NERC looking into the October 29th through 30th 2011 snowstorm in the northeastern United States. And we're about a month away from issuing our report. I think it's important to note, as the committee has recognized, that most of the customer outages, around 95%, were caused by damage to distribution facilities, the lines that deliver electricity to individual homes and businesses and that are regulated by the states rather than FERC. Numerous affected states, therefore, have launched their own inquiries into the event, and I commend their efforts. Although primarily a distribution-level event, the storm also caused transmission line and substation outages. Approximately 70 transmission lines, a number of which are BPS or bulk power system elements, subject to FERC-approved mandatory reliability standards, experience sustained outages, and that simply means an outage of more than 10 minutes in duration. FERC and NERC launched their joint study to determine the causes of the transmission and BPS facility outages and to recommend steps that utilities could take to improve their performance in maintaining grid reliability during a future large snowstorm or other similar weather event. So we've gathered a lot of data. We've done a number of interviews. We have worked with the state public utility commissions in affected states, and we've done some outreach to them. We have done site visits, and we're moving closer towards finalizing our report. Before we finalize it, of course, we'll be doing more outreach to the state PUCs to get their feedback and their input, and we'll be doing some outreach to trade associations as well. While it's premature to discuss our findings and recommendations at this time, I would like to note the key issues that we're analyzing. First, we're analyzing the effects of the storm on the specific transmission lines and substations that experienced outages, which lines and substations were forced out of service, for what reasons, and how long it took to restore those facilities. Second, we are analyzing how these outages affected the BPS as a whole, how the BPS performed during and immediately after the storm. Third, we are analyzing the effect of these facility outages on customers. We have already concluded that most of the customer outages were caused by distribution system damage. Fourth, we are analyzing the role that compliance or lack of compliance with FERC-approved mandatory reliability standards, particularly the Transmission Vegetation Management Reliability Standard, FAC 003-1, played in the transmission outages. Finally, in light of what we have learned, we are considering making several recommendations on how utilities can improve vegetation management and other practices to reduce transmission outages during snowstorms and similar weather events. Although the effects of the transmission and substation outages on the BPS and on customers were mild compared to the serious distribution system outages, there is room for improvement in these areas. So in conclusion, I want to thank the committee again for this opportunity to testify today on FERC's study of the October 2011 snowstorm's effects on transmission and BPS facilities. We look forward to providing the committee and affected state governments a copy of the report when it is completed.
Thank you very much. Mr. Getz, go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to be here this morning and have the opportunity to discuss New Hampshire's experience with weather-related electrical outages. And I want to thank Senator Shaheen for her kind introduction. I'll highlight some points from my written testimony. First, for New Hampshire, the defining event in terms of weather-related electrical outages was the December 2008 ice storm. At that time, 430,000 customers out of 690,000 business and residential customers, that's nearly two-thirds of all customers, were affected, and outages lasted up to 14 days. There were over 1,000 field crews in the responding to that storm at its peak, and there were $150 million in reported damages from that storm. Now, that storm affected more than 4 times as many customers as any previous outage in state history. The previous high point had been approximately 100,000 customers during a snowstorm in 1996. But since December 2008, there have been 3 additional extreme weather events. In February of 2010, a windstorm with gusts in excess of 60 miles per hour over a wide swath of southern New Hampshire caused outages to 360,000 customers. Restoration from that event took 6 days. In August 2011, Tropical Storm Irene moved up the East Coast, as you well know. From a New Hampshire perspective, the storm lessened in intensity as it moved northward and veered off its originally anticipated course, but nevertheless, 160,000 customers lost power from that event, and restoration took 4 days. And most recently, of course, in October 2011, with the nor'easter, more than 300,000 customers in New Hampshire suffered outages, and the restoration took 6 days. Now, the 4 events are distinguishable in terms of the cause, but the results were the same in that ice, wind, wet snow all brought trees and branches into contact with power lines, causing widespread outages. Now, the obvious question from customers and from the public, and it was an issue that we focused on in our after-action review of 2008, were the electric utilities doing everything they should be doing in terms of paying sufficient attention to vegetative management. Now, the issue of vegetative management is not a new one, as the committee well knows. The Northeast blackout from August of 2003 that resulted in 50 million people losing power in the U.S. and Canada prompted Congress to pass as part of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, refinements to the way that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and NERC handled reliability standards. At that time, reliability standards made mandatory and enforceable. And once NERC was authorized as the Electric Reliability Organization for the United States, they submitted 102 proposed reliability standards, including a transmission vegetation management program that they've recently updated in a filing to FERC that was made in 2011. It's designed to minimize encroachment from vegetation located adjacent to rights of way. And just as Congress conducted a reappraisal in the aftermath of the blackout in August 2003, states took a look at their policies with respect to vegetation management. In New Hampshire, we approved new reliability enhancement programs that increased funding and annually spent by electric distribution utilities on tree trimming and encouraged shorter trim cycles, larger trim zones. I would also like to note that I think it's important to observe in this context that the nature of preparedness was affected greatly by the events of 9/11. After 9/11, I think working relationships among utilities and commissions and state emergency management agencies was heightened. In New Hampshire, then Governor Shaheen created an advisory council on emergency preparedness and security, which advises the governor on issues involving state ability to respond to natural and human-caused disasters. And PUC personnel, myself included, were trained in incident command system, part of Homeland Security's approach to national incident management system, and it's in that role that PUC intersected with the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability, as described by Assistant Secretary Hoffman. Nevertheless, the ice storm, with its unprecedented scope and intensity, greatly strained capacity of utilities to respond and revealed a number of system processes. The ice storm after action review that we conducted focused on a number of issues. I see my time is close to out, so let me just summarize that in New Hampshire we concluded that the tree trimming was not an issue creating to the number of outages at that time, that there was utilities were following established protocols and that the protocols themselves were appropriate. But I wanted to make three general observations before I close. One is that public expectations of utility and government action are understandably high in this regard because it involves fundamental issues of public health and safety. I'd also like to say that extreme weather events are affecting large numbers of customers, and coincident with what Senator Blumenthal mentioned, I think there's an emerging issue of competition for resources, especially when you see large events moving up the coast, absorbing resources as they move. And I think I have not seen a real problem as of yet because the utilities have worked together for a long time, but it's an issue that could bear some regional and perhaps some national attention. And the third thing and last is that the interconnected grid's a complex structure with overlapping jurisdiction from a number of entities. And I'd like to say that I was very encouraged by Director Bay's comments in his written testimony, which I had a chance to go through. And it seems that they're taking all the appropriate steps in terms of process and taking a look at the transmission system as opposed to the distribution system. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions I could.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bilda, go right ahead, please.
Good morning, Senators, and thank you for asking me to summarize my written testimony before you here today. My name is John Bilda, General Manager of Norwich Public Utilities, a municipally owned natural gas, water, sewer, and electric utility serving Norwich, Connecticut, and surrounding communities. Norwich Public Utilities was established in 1904 by forward-thinking city leaders who believed that owning and operating a municipal utility was in the community's best interest. We are governed by a 5-member Board of Utility Commissioners appointed by the Norwich City Council, who are responsible for ensuring the utility is acting in the best interest of its consumers. Our Board Chairman, James Sullivan, is also here with me today in the audience. I am here to discuss our experience with electric restoration efforts following disaster events, specifically our response to Tropical Storm Irene. We deal with diverse emergencies and have an aggressive system in place to maximize reliability, including a routine tree trimming program. Our system inspection program includes infrared inspections and pole integrity examinations. We invest in new technology to advance our ability to provide service. We deployed 32 miles of high-bandwidth fiber optic communication lines that link the entire city communication network, including our ability to monitor and operate substation connections with the transmission system. Since we own this asset, we don't have to rely on third-party telecommunication operators for this critical communication component. We work with city departments and emergency first responders to maximize resources, improve communications, eliminate unnecessary redundancies, and streamline processes. We relocated and upgraded the city's Emergency Operations Center to our Utilities Operations Center. Placing important stakeholders in one location ensures consistent and effective communication during emergencies. Internally, we have a positive working relationship with our unionized workforce. We negotiated changes in job descriptions for our underground construction crews and cross-trained them to work as support staff for our electric line crews. We can now double our restoration capacity in-house by pairing line crews with construction crews. When a major disaster affects Norwich electric distribution system, we can expand our workforce internally before relying on outside mutual aid. Our employees live in our community, possess local and institutional knowledge of the system, which makes a marked difference in an emergency. We are members of Northeast Public Power Association, or NEPA, which supports our request for mutual aid when needed. NEPA has a mutual aid system where New England-based public power systems support each other in times of need. As the current president of NEPA, I can tell you that although this system works well, we are constantly looking at ways to improve its effectiveness, including further leveraging technology to quickly and efficiently fulfill mutual aid requests. This system works because of the good faith and mutual understanding created over the years amongst public power communities. In short, all NEPA members know that they are no more than a few hours away from the assistance to restore power to their community. When the regional electric transmission lines go down or are damaged, no amount of crews can help us restore the power. We receive our electricity through transmission lines controlled by the independent system operator and transmission owners. One strategy we initiated to keep the lights on in Norwich when the transmission lights go down was to build a microgrid. In an emergency, our microgrid can supply a significant portion of normal power to our community. We want to expand the system, but are facing regulatory hurdles at ISO New England that affect our ability to bring new assets online. I understand FERC's Office of Enforcement has been asked to review our scenario and issue their assessment on the use of microgrids so our system can operate with regulatory certainty. So in conclusion, we proactively develop policies that enable us to employ our own resources first to rapidly restore power. We can further expand our workforce using NEPA's well-coordinated and effective public power mutual aid system. And additionally, we have taken steps to protect our community from prolonged power outage due to situations outside of our control. As a public power system, we value our men and women employees and have a successful business model that places our community's needs first. Again, thank you for allowing me to speak here with you this morning.
Thank you all very much for your testimony. Let me ask a few questions and then defer to Senator Shaheen. Let me ask you the same question I asked Ms. Hoffman about this recommendation from the MIT Energy Initiative study on the future of the electric grid. They recommended there that the IEEE standard reporting metric for distribution level disturbances should be followed uniformly throughout the industry. I guess I'd be interested in any of you telling me whether you agree with that recommendation, and if it should be followed uniformly throughout the industry, How do we get that done?
Those standards are the one that Norwich follows, and we submit that cooperatively to the state for review. So we're comparing ourselves on the national level with those standards right now. How that gets expanded across the nation, something that would put everyone on a level playing field.
Right, but my question is, how should it get expanded across the nation? What should the federal government be? Should we have FERC doing this? Should NERC do this? Should Mr. Getz, you're an expert on these matters, having been at the state level. What do you think the proper? I mean, I know we love to keep our separate jurisdictions when we talk about energy distribution and transmission, but I think we need to find ways to keep those separate jurisdictions from interfering with getting to the right result. And I'd be interested in your view as to how we could do that.
Well, I guess I'd say two things in that regard. First of all, uniformity across the states and a number of areas, including reporting like that, is critical on a state level, a regional level, and a national level. It seems to me the most direct route to implementing a standard like that would be through the NERC's reliability standards, that they would consider it and then submit to FERC.
Do you know if they're considering that?
I do not.
Mr. Bay, do you have any information on this?
Well, I don't know whether NERC is considering that specifically, but under the Federal Power Act, Section 215, FERC's jurisdiction and thus NERC's jurisdiction in turn would not extend to distribution. So I'm not sure presently that either FERC or NERC would have the legal authority to require the reporting or certain kinds of reporting with respect to distribution-related outages.
So Congress would have to change the law in order for us to have any kind of authority to require uniform reporting.
That would be my understanding. I would want to consult with the Office of General Counsel, obviously, at FERC. But Section 215 right now has a carve-out with respect to the mandatory reliability standards when it comes to distribution. So the reliability standards do not apply to distribution.
Let me ask also, Mr. Bilda, you obviously put in place a whole series of best practices, I would characterize them as, in your utility, which you're to be commended for. What can be done at the federal level to try to ensure that these same kinds of best practices are implemented nationwide?
In terms of the NERC standards, a component of the NERC standards require a culture of compliance. And that's something, at least at the local level, which makes the local utilities or public power very successful because of the culture of a small organization can be developed to meet those culture of compliance. Expanding that, through NERC, through the rest of the utilities, may be a way in which, some of the responses where they may not have been as rapidly as public power may be improved.
I guess just as a follow-up, I'm not real clear what concrete action that you've described there. I think expanding the culture of compliance is a good idea. I don't have any problem with that. I just don't know, is there some concrete action that you think ought to be taken by someone, either the FERC or NERC or Congress or anybody else?
I really can't speak to that right now. I can speak to what works real well in Norwich.
Okay. Mr. Getz, did you have a comment on this or not?
Only to say that you do run into the issue that Director Bay spoke to, is when you've crossed over the line into distribution level requirements that are currently outside the scope of FERC jurisdiction. There would be some additional action would have to be taken. Other than that, it's through voluntary organizations like NARUC, regional organizations that I've been a part of, that you can encourage some commonality and uniformity, but to go beyond that would require perhaps some congressional action of some sort.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you. I want to pursue this a little bit more because, Mr. Bay, you pointed out that currently FERC does not have the authority to regulate standards for distribution. And the question that I have is, should it?
I think that's quintessentially the policy decision that Congress will have to resolve.
Oh,
because
very diplomatically put.
Well, as Mr. Getz points out, historically there has been that divide between transmission, Senator Shaheen, and distribution. And so the question is, if Congress wants more data at the distribution level, what, if anything, should Congress do? I should footnote my previous answer with one remark, and that is I don't know whether DOE has some separate authority that allows it to collect that information, and whether there's something there that you could build upon. That I don't know, so I'm only speaking on behalf of FERC.
Okay. Tom, I'm going to call you Tom for purposes of the questioning here. Should FERC have that responsibility, or should some entity have the authority to say these are standards that should be followed with respect not just to transmission but also to distribution?
I certainly think there should be some distinguish between reporting and actual standards. Certainly, to collect and report at a national level from distribution level utilities makes a lot of sense. Whether you're going to enforce the standards at the distribution level, I think there may be a legal issue involved in doing that. But setting some minimum standards as a general matter makes a lot of sense as a policy matter. I think you have to, again, with any of these things, recognize to the extent that there might be regional differences, issue we've always faced at NARUC, but some requiring that some of these IEEE types of standards are minimums for utilities across the country, I think is a very sound policy move.
Mr. Bilda, recognizing that you have incorporated a lot of, as you pointed out, the IEEE standards and are following some best practices that are commendable. How do we get others? If we don't have some sort of enforcement mechanism, some umbrella way to say to all distribution companies, this is what you have to do, how do we get other companies to do the kinds of proactive improvements that your company has taken on?
I think in Norwich's case, the accountability lies right with the community for us to perform. So I would expect as customers continue to experience maybe prolonged outages, that may, drive more accountability into some kind of standards, because the accountability for our organization is held right at the local level in terms of the standards and the reliability of our system.
Sure, and for a co-op, I can understand how that helps to drive policy. It's harder when you're dealing with an investor-owned utility and consumers have no choices for where they're going to get their power. So how does that play into decisions about how to ensure reliability? Any of you want to respond to that? I mean, as the former chair of the Public Utilities Commission, how should Public Utilities Commissions look at that issue when it comes to reliability? Is that a requirement that you can make for companies within your regulatory authority?
Certainly, a state commission can look at those issues and either through an adjudication or rulemaking require that regulated utilities take those kinds of actions.
And how common is that?
Well, in terms of, in the New Hampshire example, after the December 8 ice storm, for instance, we took a look at a whole list of issues that came out of the storm in terms of, going down to the issue of trim zones and trim cycles and how much is spent. So there are those opportunities, and we took some of those actions. But I think from state to state, there's usually an initiating event like a major storm that prompts a kind of follow-up action.
My time is up, Mr. Chairman.
Why don't you go ahead and complete
Okay.
any additional questions you have? I don't have any more questions, so go ahead.
Just to follow up on this issue of data collection and reporting, one of the things that we're considering or will be considering soon in Congress is a cybersecurity bill. And I don't know if anybody heard the report on public radio this morning talking about one of the systems in our country that is most at risk for cyber attacks is our electric grid. And we've been focused primarily on weather this morning, but clearly there is the potential for a cyber attack to also take down an electric grid. Do you see that, I guess, Mr. Bay, I'll ask you this question. Do you see that that issue should be treated differently than weather-related emergencies with respect to requirements for data collection and reporting and best practices? Or should we be treating everybody the same? And given that, how do we resolve the issue of what happens at the distribution level?
I think that's a good question. It's also a difficult question, as good questions often are. The difficulty is that, again, our jurisdiction relates to elements of the bulk power system. So if you're talking about the local utility that serves retail customers, we don't have jurisdiction over them, nor does NERC, and so that the reliability standards won't apply to them as well. But clearly there is an issue there to the extent that there is a concern that a cyber attack could be launched at a local utility just as it could be launched at an element of the bulk power system.
Right, and I assume that that could happen in a major metropolitan area in a way that would have a significant impact on the country. Is that?
I would assume that that is possible. There are many large utilities that serve retail customers in large metropolitan areas.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. I read Richard Clark's book several years ago, and it kept me up at night about the cyber war.
Right.
And I think in terms of requirements of utilities, I think when we're talking about in terms of weather-related outages, from a legal perspective, we're looking at what's the extent of the interstate commerce cause and what can the jurisdiction be when you get down to the distribution level. With terms to cybersecurity, I think there may be a broader entree from a legal perspective because it's ultimately a national security issue. And I also have a concern, a practical concern from the state's level, and it's an issue I had raised as a member of NARUC's Critical Infrastructure Committee, that small states especially may not have the wherewithal to be really looking at issues of cybersecurity and make sure that utilities are complying, are doing more than self-certifying. So to the extent that can be a federal response, a congressional response, I think it's very important in the area of cybersecurity.
Thank you. You talked about in your testimony finding after the snowstorm in October of last year that the utilities had complied with their requirements to trim vegetation in a way that was appropriate, that there was nothing inappropriate about their actions. So given that, are there other things that they ought to be looking at to be more responsive in weather-related emergencies. You mentioned, Mr. Bilda, cross-training for your crews so that they could work both line and construction. Are there other technologies that we ought to be incentivizing our utilities to use in a way that will make them more efficient in responding in emergencies? And I'll ask you, Tom, if you would answer that first, and then maybe Mr. Bilda, you could talk a little more about other technologies that you're looking at that you think might be able to allow you to better respond.
Yes, Senator. Well, first of all, I want to reemphasize this point about distribution lines and trees along distribution lines. It's a very different situation from transmission lines that normally have wide rights of way, and the likelihood of fall-in is somewhat small. Distribution lines through neighborhoods, there's always that tension between the aesthetics of a lovely neighborhood and reliability and how much tree trimming. So there's always going to be that vulnerability to a lot of outages from distribution levels from trees. But having said that, there are a number of things that we pointed out in 2008. The importance of state-of-the-art outage management systems for utilities to have so that they can know more clearly, more directly where the outages are. Because there are some utilities, a number of them, who don't really have below the transmission level a really robust smart grid type of approach to knowing where the outages are and responding to them. There's also a real need for better communications from utilities to local emergency management directors to the public. As you know, there's heightened expectations of the public. They want virtually to know in a real-time way, what's the cause of the outage, when is my power coming back, and so I think more focus on social media as a way of communicating that to customers is a very important thing as well.
Mr. Bilda, are there other technologies you're looking at?
Yeah, we actually have a GIS system, a geographic information system, in place in our community that our utility operates on behalf of the city. That's linked directly with our outage management system. And in the event of Storm Irene, when all this was working together in the city's emergency operations center, we could actually coordinate where trees were down through Public Works and map all that and do all the prioritization work from the office so that our crews were dispatched as efficiently and effectively as possible. Having said that, we are a recipient of a DOE Smart Grid grant, of which we're maybe about 60% complete in the deployment of AMI metering, which provides not only information out to the customers, but a whole bunch of information back into the utilities. And we had some portion of that integrated in with the GIS and the outage management system, where we were receiving meaningful and helpful information in terms of determining what's going on in the field without having to roll a truck.
Wow. Did I understand you to say that with respect to the microgrid, you have a proceeding that is pending before Mr. Bay's office?
Yes, they're without traveling into too many details. We have asked. I understand we've asked through CMEC, the Connecticut Municipal Electric Energy Cooperative, for some maybe clarity in terms of conforming with a tariff that exists at ISO New England, so that our efforts to deploy distributed generation out in our community and other municipal electric communities in the state of Connecticut to not only reduce demand, capacity demand during peak days, and transmission demand during peak days, while at the same time providing for an emergency backup when other events occur.
And can you, just so that I'm very clear on what you're talking about, when you're talking about a microgrid, exactly what are you talking about?
the deployment and dispatch of, in our case, they're small 2.5 megawatt generators that we've strategically located next to loads that, we can operate these generators and meet the need of the load while reducing the amount of energy that we take physically from the grid or the transmission system. So it's a very, very localized generation system that, the electrons physically flow just in the wires in the city of Norwich.
And where does the generation come from for the distributed?
It's from a what they call a RICE unit, a reciprocating internal combustion engine that runs on environmentally high clean diesel with SCR emission equipment installed on them.
Okay. And so, Mr. Bay, without going into the particulars of this particular proceeding, can you talk about what the concerns are with respect to allowing this kind of microgrid to be used throughout the system?
I think the general concern, Senator Shaheen, that CMEC has is whether the use of that microgrid or the distributed generation is perhaps inconsistent with the tariff in place with ISO New England. And again, without getting into the details, I can tell you that we are aware of this issue, that we have been meeting with CMEC and indeed have a meeting scheduled with them in the next few days. So we're having, I think, some productive discussions with them.
Good. Well, this is just sort of a general question, but as Mr. Getz and Mr. Bilda were talking about the recommendations for what could be done to respond more quickly in emergency cases, they talked about technology, the cross-training. To what extent are we seeing utilities adopting those kinds of new technologies? And are there ways that we can incentivize this kind of activity? If there are concerns about the regulation side, are there ways that we can incentivize to help our utilities be able to be more responsive in these kinds of emergencies? Because, while I appreciate what Ms. Hoffman said about not having full data, certainly appears that we're going to be experiencing more and more of these kinds of events. And given the high public expectations, we need to figure out better how to respond to them. So I don't know, Mr. Bay, if you want to respond to that.
I'm a little bit out of my realm right now just because I'm with the Office of Enforcement, not with the Office of Energy Policy and Innovation or in the Office of Energy Market Regulation. But I can tell you, Senator, that FERC actually has different incentives in place for new technology. For example, there are transmission rate incentives. There are other incentives that can be given for new forms of technology that incent a utility through a higher rate of return to adopt and to use those technologies. And I also know that in practice, some of these innovations are making a difference. For example, there's something known as phase angle regulators, which are PARs, which are now being used by a number of utilities. And those are very helpful for system operators in terms of being aware of or having greater situational awareness. So things are happening, as Mr. Bilda and Mr. Getz indicated, and I think those are positive developments.
Thank you. Tom or Mr. Bilda, do either
If I could add,
Sure.
if I could add to that, though, if there isn't some kind of incentive or some kind of subsidization or some kind of value proposition in the ISO market or in some kind of market, the microgrids or the distributed generation will not expand and flourish at all.
Tom?
Well,
I'll give you the final word here.
Thank you. The incentives that we apply at the state level is we conduct our investigations, bring the utilities in. Over the years, going back to the Northeast blackout, we created these reliability enhancement programs, made it clear that the utilities could recover their investments. We made it clear that budgets could be increased, and to the extent that storms outside of what were expected they might incur costs. There's an opportunity for them to come back in. So at this point, it's almost on an annual basis that we're looking at what happened the previous year, what was spent, where are the capital budgets, where are the O&M budgets, and you're seeing the utilities respond after storms, and in some respects leapfrogging one another in different ways in terms of their reporting systems, their outage management systems. So at that level, I think from New Hampshire's perspective, I've been very encouraged.
Good. Well, thank you all very much for your testimony and for being with us this morning. Obviously, these are issues that we need to continue to work on, but appreciate your insights. At this time, I'll close the hearing.